Snellio, oh, there it is. All right,
Yes.
we're good to go.
Let's see. Okay.
Want to mute your phone, Steve?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a general introduction to plant pathology, which is the study of diseases in plants. This leaf is obviously diseased. This slideshow is put together by the University of Iowa, and so it mainly features two crops that are abundant in Iowa, the soybeans and corn, maize, but the general principles apply to other plants as well. So what is a plant disease? It's any abnormal condition that alters the appearance or the function of a plant. A physiological process that affects some or all plant functions. These disease may also reduce yield and quality of the harvested product. Disease is a process or a change that occurs over time. It does not occur instantly like injury. So when you look at a plant that has a disease, what you see is the symptoms. The symptoms are the changes in the plant, the color, shape, functions of a plant in response to the disease. So those are symptoms. A sign of a plant disease is physical evidence of the pathogen. For example, if you see fungus or bacteria oozing or nematodes or whatever, those are signs of plant disease. So there are infectious diseases and there are not infectious diseases. Here what we're talking about infectious diseases, which are caused by living organisms that attack the plant, obtain their nutrition from it. So an organism, which is a parasitic organism, a parasite gets its nourishment from its host. And so that's what we have with infectious plant diseases. And that, in this case, the parasite is called a pathogen. So there are fungi, bacteria, virus, nematodes, and some other groups that are pathogens of many different kinds of plants. And the plant that is getting sick, that's invaded by the pathogen, is called the host. So here's some examples. Fungi growing on a petri dish, bacteria, viruses, nematodes. These are the most common disease-causing organisms. So we have the host, the plant, and we have the disease-causing organism, and we also need a favorable environment. Even the most susceptible plants exposed to huge amounts of a pathogen will not develop disease unless environmental conditions are favorable. So that results in a disease triangle. On one side, on the bottom, is the host. On the right side is a pathogen. On the other side is the environment. So you have to have all of these things working together to cause a disease. And so we'll be talking about that some more. So let's look at the different types of pathogens. Fungi are a very common pathogen. Most fungi are beneficial, but other fungi cause disease. It could be plant disease. Some cause human and livestock diseases. Most of the times you can't see a fungus without looking under a microscope. Sometimes you see fungus when it forms a mushroom. That's a fungus. So most of a fungus is small, thin, thread-like filaments. The picture in the upper right corner, the brown things are the fungus filaments. Fungi reproduce by forming spores. And in the lower right picture is pictures of some spores. Different kinds of fungi produce different kinds of spores. The second group of pathogens is bacteria. They're very small, smaller than the fungi, much smaller than the fungi. And they can only be seen with a microscope. Bacteria can multiply very quickly. Under favorable, they multiply by basically one bacteria splits into two, becomes two bacteria. And under favorable conditions, you can do that every 20 minutes. So in 20 minutes, the population of bacteria can double. And then in the next 20 minutes, double again. So you can go from a few bacteria to millions or billions of them in, in a day or a couple of days. They tend to clump together into masses. They don't move around very much, though some of them do move. Some get their food from dead or decaying organic matter, and some get their food from living plant matter. They can be spread from plant to plant by wind, by splashing rain. Some are spread by insects. You can even spread some by walking through your field when the leaves are wet. Some of the bacteria can rub off onto your clothes and then rub off onto the next plant. They work their way into the plant to cause disease by going in through the natural plant openings, the stomata and other openings on the plant, or through injuries, like if a insect is eating the plant, then that creates an injury and the bacteria can get in there. Viruses is another important organism that causes disease. They cause disease in people and animals too, like the flu and polio and warts, rabies. And they also cause some very serious plant diseases. And viruses are even smaller than bacteria. You need an electron microscope to see a virus. And viruses are not complete living systems. They can't duplicate themselves. So what they do is they go into a living cell and they take over the cell's reproductive mechanisms and force the cell to make more of them, of the virus. It's kind of a sneaky thing. And they just go in there and take over. And they're almost always transmitted by insects or other animals. They can be transmitted by nematodes. Though it is possible to also transmit viruses just by physical contact. Tobacco mosaic virus is a virus that can be spread just by physical contact.
I have a question.
Steve, you have a question?
Yeah.
Those viruses, when they enter a cell and the cell duplicate, then they are maybe also duplicated. My question is there any cell they enter? So they can enter a cell of animal, of humans, of plants, and do the same thing?
No, they're specific to specific plants or animals. You know, that a virus that will cause a disease in a animal is not going to cause a disease in a plant. It won't interact with a plant cell at all. And some are general, and they can infect a number of different kinds of plants. And some viruses are very specific, and they can only infect one type of plant. You know,
So
maybe
they can be transmitted via by animal, but they do not affect the animal.
yeah. For example, a virus that's transmitted by a insect, the insect will eat, you know, will chew on the plant, and will get some of the virus into its system from the plant. That virus will not make the insect sick, but the virus will be there inside of the insect, and then the insect will go and chew on a different plant, and some of the virus that's inside the insect will get into the other plant and infect that plant.
Okay.
So the insect carries the virus from one plant to another, but it doesn't make the insect sick. And when I was in graduate school, we talked to a lady who was in charge of the electron microscope lab there. And she told us a story that somebody she knew brought in a sample for her to look at, that, you know, a diseased plant that they wanted to see if there was a virus in it. And this person had told the technician that he had stopped smoking, but when the technician looked at this sample under the microscope, she knew that he had not stopped smoking because she found tobacco mosaic virus on the sample. And so she knew that he had been handling some tobacco products and gotten the virus on his hands from handling the tobacco. And it had gotten onto the sample that he had brought to her. So sometimes viruses can be moved around by things other than insects. You know, they can get on us, and we can move them from plant to plant. So you know, if you're growing tomatoes or peppers or some other crops that are susceptible to something like tobacco mosaic virus, it's not a bad idea to wash your hands before you handle the plants after you've smoked or handled tobacco. So nematodes, they're little worms. Most of them are too small to see with the naked eye. You need a microscope to see them. There are different kinds of nematodes that do all kinds of different things. Not all of them cause disease. Some of them are beneficial. But there are some that are parasites on animals or insects or fungi or other nematodes or plants. So plants, the nematodes, excuse me, some of them just grab onto the plant. You know, they swim around in the soil and the water that's in the soil. And some of them just grab onto the plant and stick their mouth parts, their stylet, into the plant and suck the juices out of the plant cell. Some of them actually burrow into the plant root and live inside the plant root. So this is the disease cycle. This is how diseases come about, how they get to where they are. So let's start out with some survival structure. You know, for a nematode, it would be an egg. The nematode lays the eggs in the soil, and that's how it survives until the next time it attacks a plant. For a fungus, there would be a spore. The fungus makes spores, or some fungi just make tightly packed you know, structures out of their own threads, and that's their survival mechanism. Bacteria can go dormant, and so once they come, so that's how they survive, and then they have to get dispersed and come in contact with the plant. That's the infection, when the pathogen comes in contact with the plant. And then the pathogen colonizes the plant, and that results in symptoms in the plant, and the disease organism multiplies in the plant and produces more of the survival structures to start the cycle all over again. So here's a comparison of some disease cycles for the different types of pathogens. So fungi, they survive on crop residue or in the soil, or there could be alternate hosts, which is, an alternate host is a plant other than your crop plant that fungi can live on. So it might be a weed, it might be another crop plant, it might be trees in the neighborhood. Depends on the fungi, what plants it can live in. And then it's dispersed by wind or by rain or by insects. If it's in the soil, it might just come in contact with plant roots growing through the soil. And so the effects, it can infect the plant directly, which means it just bores into the plant through pressure. It can get into a plant through wounds on the surface of the plant, you know, where the plant is damaged. It can get into the plant through insect feeding. That makes an opening for the fungi to get in. So bacteria also survive in crop residue, soil, and alternate hosts. They can also survive inside insect vectors. For example, one of the bacterial diseases that we have here in Iowa is bacterial wilt of cucurbits, of the squash and pumpkins and melons. And it survives our Iowa winters inside of the intestines of a cucumber beetle. So the cucumber beetle, you know, eats the squash plant and gets some of the bacteria inside of it, and it doesn't hurt the beetle. But the beetle survives through the winter. It moves from plant to plant, and that's how the bacteria survives until the next season, the next time it can infect the plant. So in that case, the insect also is the dispersal mechanism for the bacteria. That's how the pathogen gets from one plant to another. Other bacteria can be blown in the wind or splashed by rain. And then for the bacteria to get into the plant to cause disease, there has to be some kind of opening. It can't just push itself in like a fungus can. So it has to be a wound or a natural opening in the plant, or damage caused by the insect feeding. Some insects which suck the sap out of the plant, they stick their feeding tube directly into the plant, and that can push a virus into a bacteria or a virus into the plant. viruses are not as diverse as the bacteria and fungi. They can only survive inside an alternate host or inside an insect vector. And they're almost always dispersed by insects or some other animal. And that's how they get into the plant, is by the insect feeding on the plant. So viruses are really dependent on other organisms. They're dependent on the plant to reproduce itself, to make more virus, and they're dependent on insects or alternate hosts to survive and move from one plant to another. And nematodes can survive in crop residue or in the soil. They can live in the soil for a long time. They get moved around by anything that moves the soil. So when you're tilling, that can move the nematodes around. If you till one field and then go to the next field, you could be, if there's nematodes in the first field, you could be taking nematodes to the next field. They could be even go from one place to another in the soil that's stuck on your boots as you're walking around your farm. And they can also be moved by water running through the soil or across the surface of the soil. And they always infect the plant by directly burrowing into it or biting it. So the source of inoculum, it varies with each disease. So inoculum is the part of the pathogen, the life stage of the pathogen that blows around and gets dispersed in the new plant. And so it could be produced on the residues left in the field. You know, the fungus can be making spores, growing on the crop residues and producing spores, will then infect other plants. It could be in the soil. Like there's fungi and nematodes that live in the soil, and so they might be there waiting for the roots to grow down and infect them. They can be on other weeds or other crops in the area. If the weeds or the other crops are diseased, then that can be a source for a disease that gets into your crops. Sometimes the disease can persist in the seed. So if you're saving seeds, you want to be sure to save seed from plants that don't have any disease, because there are some diseases that can get into the seed, and then when you plant that seed, the pathogen's right there ready to infect the new plant.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Inoculum, what does that word mean? The word inoculum. What does it mean?
Oh, inoculum, that's the part of the pathogen that gets dispersed to get to the new plant. So like for a fungus, that's the spore that blows in the wind and lands on the new plant and causes disease. For a nematode, it would be the egg, and the new nematode hatches out of the egg. For a bacteria, it would just be some living bacteria that gets dispersed, moved to the new plant. Does that make sense?
That the way it is transported. Understand, yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Good question. So, so these are ways that the diseases can get moved around. They can be in the soil, which sticks to equipment or tools, carried by wind or water, insect vectors, carried by animals, birds, and people. for example, we have in some of our greenhouses, we have nematodes in the soil. And so when we're using a tool in that greenhouse in the soil, we'll wash the tool before we take it to use it somewhere else. So we don't move the nematodes with us. So either the inoculum can be in the soil and the plant goes to it, or the inoculum can move to the plant. That's basically what this is. So in the picture on the left, cultivating a field, and if there's diseased plants in that field, then that disease could be spread to other plants in the field by movement of the cultivator. You know, that spores or whatever bacteria can get onto the cultivator and then rub off onto other plants. And the picture on the right, those are soybean seeds, and some of them are black because they have a fungus growing on them. So in this case, the disease is being spread on the seed. So the next step in disease is for the pathogen to get into the plant. And so this is an example with fungi. You know, other kinds of pathogens get into the plant differently, but in this case, the fungus spore germinates, and it grows down into the plant. And then the last two slides, it's on the right, it's on the bottom of the leaf or whatever plant part it's on. It's making a structure that's producing more spores. So it's completing its life cycle that way. Some diseases have only one cycle during the growing season. So, you know, once the plant's infected, you know, plants only get infected once during the season, and then there's not a disease problem until the next season. But some diseases, you can have repeating cycles during the growing season. So, you know, the fungus gets onto the plant, and it grows there, and it produces spores, and then those spores blow onto the next plant, and it grows there, and it produces spores, and it can do that repeatedly during the season. So you can have repeating cycles of disease. And how often that happens depends on the pathogen, on the susceptibility of the host, and on the environmental conditions. Those three things of the disease triangle. If the environmental conditions are not favorable, then it's not going to produce another cycle of disease. Okay, so the last part of the disease cycle is pathogen survival. So it can survive, some pathogens survive in the soil, some survive in crop residue, some survive in weeds or non-crop hosts. Some survive in the seeds or other plant parts. Some survive inside of insects, and sometimes they just continue to, if it's a mild climate and the plants are still growing, they might just continue to grow and form more disease on more plants. So we have the sign and the symptom. The sign is the pathogen. When you see the pathogen, that's the sign. And a symptom is the plant, what happens with the plant, whether it's discoloration or an unusual growth or whatever. And again, a disease requires a susceptible host, a pathogen, and a favorable environment. We'll keep coming back to that. The reason that that's important is because when you want to control a disease, if sometimes you can manage one or the other of these three things in order to control your disease. So if you have, because all three of them need to be together to cause a disease. So if you have a host that's not susceptible, then you don't have disease. Or if you can exclude the pathogen from your fields, then you don't have a disease. Or if the environment is too hot or too cold or too dry or too wet, then you won't have the disease.
Can you repeat what you just said, please? Or don't get it?
If you
Say
can,
it again?
if you can repeat what you just said, Steve.
You won't get the disease if what?
Oh, you need all three. You need a susceptible host, you need a pathogen, and you need a favorable environment. If you don't have any one of those, then you won't get a disease.
But then a question: if you have a strong, healthy plant, would it still get a disease?
It depends. If a strong, healthy plant is going to be more resistant to disease than a weak plant, and in some cases that will be enough to prevent the disease. In some cases, the pathogen might be vigorous enough to be able to cause disease anyway.
Think of it maybe in terms of like a sliding scale. Like there's not just a healthy plant and a not healthy plant. There's a range from like, this is a definitely not healthy plant and this is the most healthy plant you could possibly have. And your plant is somewhere in the spectrum. And then also the disease could be anywhere of like a weak disease and a very vigorous, strong disease, and somewhere in that spectrum. So if you have a strong, healthy plant, but a weak disease, maybe it won't infect the plant. But if you have a strong disease and a weak plant, then there's a higher probability of it infecting the plant. So it's not a yes or no, there's a spectrum of possibility there.
Yeah, and we want to manage our farm so that the possibility is less. Now, we'll probably never completely eliminate the possibility that there'll be a problem, but we want to manage it so that the probability that there will be a problem is less.
I have a question about the sign and symptom, because all the things, the fungi, bacteria, viruses, and toads are very small. So do you have to see them with a microscope? That is the sign?
In many cases, yes, you have to use a microscope. Sometimes.
But you would be able to see on the plant.
No, that is the symptom already. That is already the symptom.
With fungi, you can often see the fungus. Like on tomatoes, if they're infected with late blight, for example, on the underside of the leaves, you can see a whitish or grayish moldy area, and that's actually the fungus that you're seeing. Or you might see a black sticky area on some other plant that would be the spores of fungus. So there are some cases when you can see the pathogen actually. You know, with some bacteria, if there's a lot of them, you might see a slimy ooze somewhere on the plant. So, you know, you might not be seeing individual fungi or individual bacteria, but when they're grouped together in a large group, you might be able to see them. But most of the time, a microscope will help. Yeah, so mainly what we see is the symptoms. Once in a while, we'll see a sign, but not always.
So normally you would check your plants once in a couple of months, really like with. No, I don't know because
That's too much.
because that is because the sign. If you want to do something, you want to catch it in the sign, not in the symptom.
You'll probably see the symptom long before you see a sign. You'll only see a sign with your naked eye when it gets to be really bad and there's a lot of the pathogens altogether. And so if you can find it before then you have a better chance of controlling it before it gets to be worse.
So you see the symptom before you see the sign?
Yes. Because the pathogen is so small, you generally don't see it.
Yeah. Big glass.
When you have to walk on your field and look at your plants.
Every day. Every day. I go every day.
Talk to them.
Yeah. Not over
So
months.
you have to
Every day.
look at ants. Okay, there must be something.
That's too late if you look over once.
Every day.
Steve, can we have a break?
Yeah, we can have a break.
Break here.
Als ik 2 dagen ergens ben, kan het te laat zijn. Ik heb sommige die niet in de gaten houden, kan die zomaar in één keer helemaal. Nee, maar even, je bent wel heel overal. Weet je wat het begin dan ken ik wat goed. Ja, nee, je ziet hier gewoon voor. Ja, dat is wel.
Ready?
Nem informação para rápida. That's the best. Okay.
Ready? All right, here we go. So now, now we're going to focus more on how to prevent diseases. So let's see.
Before, because I have a question of the first part, because you said there are two types of disease. One type of disease are the diseases that are because of pathogen,
Yes.
and you have the second type of disease that are without pathogens. So now what you're talking about here are the diseases that are
Yeah.
with,
So what infectious diseases are disease caused by a pathogen. Diseases that are not infectious are caused by something other than a pathogen, and that could be like a nutrient deficiency, which we looked at in some other. That could be considered a disease, nutrient deficiency, or it could be caused by pesticide drift, or by cold temperatures or hot temperatures.
Okay, yes. External factors. Okay.
Good. Yeah, real good question. So this is another look at the disease triangle. I like this one because it's like 3 circles, and where the circles overlap, that's where you have disease. It has to be all 3 circles overlapping in order to get the disease. So the environment will have a lot of different characteristics. Sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's windy, sometimes it's still. And so when those things overlap, when an environment that's favorable for the disease, for example, one that's wet enough for fungus spores to germinate on the leaf surface, when that conducive environment overlaps with the presence of a virulent pathogen on the leaf surface, and the plant is susceptible to that, then you get disease. If you could have the host and the pathogen, the leaf is covered with fungus spores, for example, but the environment is too dry so that the spores can't germinate, and then you don't have disease. You could have the environment is favorable for the growth of the pathogen. The pathogen is there, but the host is resistant to that particular pathogen, so disease doesn't happen. So on. So control measures. That's what we're interested in doing, is what can we do to control the incidence of disease, to prevent a disease from happening. So you can reduce the amount of inoculum, the amount of spores, for example, that spread the disease, and that will minimize the disease. You can create a stronger plant that will reduce the amount of disease, or you could perhaps create a more favorable environment that will reduce the amount of disease. So here's 6 principles of disease management: avoidance, exclusion, eradication, protection, resistant varieties, and therapy. So we'll look at all of these. So avoidance is avoiding disease, preventing disease. for example, by altering the planting time or planting in an area where there's no disease inoculum, someplace where the environmental conditions are not present. So you can avoid the disease by choosing a geographical area. You know, if you're growing in a geographical area that's where there's a lot of problem with a certain disease, maybe you can grow another crop that doesn't have such disease problems in that area. If there are different parts of your farm that one part might have more wind or be drier than another part, you might grow certain crops in one of those parts to make it less susceptible to disease. If you know you have nematodes in one of your fields, or like we have nematodes in our greenhouse, then crops that are susceptible to that you can grow somewhere else. This is all avoidance. You can select seed and planting material that is free of disease. So some diseases are seed-borne. If you're propagating a plant by grafting or whatever, you can make sure that the material that you're grafting is free of disease. Sometimes you can avoid a disease by choosing what time you plant the crop. Like some diseases might be prevalent on some crops in the middle of the rainy season and not so much at the beginning of the rainy season. You know, so you can choose the time that you're planting your crop to minimize disease. Or there might be some varieties that are not susceptible to disease. For example, I'm thinking more about resistance, but these disease-escaping varieties, that might be like if there's a fungus that needs a wet leaf surface to germinate, and it needs that leaf surface to be wet for a certain period of time, a disease-escaping variety might be one that is more spread out, less compact, so there's more space between the leaves, so the leaves dry out more quickly, and that might help it avoid the disease because the leaves dry out before the spores can germinate. And you might be able to avoid disease by modifying cultural practices.
So it'd be an example of that, maybe putting a fan on your plants to dry them out after a rain, something like that, Steve?
Yeah. Yeah, if you're starting transplants to plant out, put a fan on the transplants so that that could reduce the humidity around the plants. So a disease-causing organism might not be able to get started there. Exclusion, preventing inoculum from entering or established in the field. So seed treatment, sometimes there are some diseases that are transmitted in the seed, and the seed can be treated to prevent that. For example, there are some bacterial diseases that can be transmitted in the seed, and you can subject the seed to a certain amount of heat for a certain length of time, and that will kill the bacteria without killing the seed. So that's a way to keep that that bacteria from coming onto your farm. inspection of your planting material. If you're bringing in plants from off of your farm, you can inspect them to make sure they don't have any obvious disease symptoms. There are some certification services, some places that will certify that a seed or a plant is disease-free. For example, some of the seeds that we buy, the seed company will certify that it's free of a certain organism, a certain disease. And of course, there are quarantines that laws that prevent moving plant material from one place to another to prevent the spread of disease. And cleaning farm equipment is a way to exclude disease from someplace where it isn't. You know, if you're like, in this case, the guy has evidently been driving his tractor in one field and he doesn't want to take diseases from that field into the next field, so he's hosing off his tractor to get the soil and pathogens off of the tractor before he goes to another field. Eradication. So after an pathogen is already there in your field, you want to manage it so that it doesn't become well established and spread widely. So, you know, the bigger the area, the more difficult this is. So it can be applied to individual plants or seed lots or fields or regions, but not over. It's hard to eradicate a problem over a wide area. So ways to accomplish eradication: you can destroy weeds that are reservoirs of the pathogens or insect vectors, or you can destroy the insect vectors of the disease. So, like if there's a virus that lives in some weeds, you can eliminate those weeds from your farm, eliminate that source of the virus. Or if a disease is spread by an insect, you can try to keep the insect away from your plant. So biological control of the plant pathogen, or it could be biological control of a vector, an insect vector. Biological control is a very interesting thing to me. It's using one organism to prevent another organism from causing a disease. So when you prevent a disease in your fields by spraying EM on your crops, that's using a biological control. The bacteria in the effective microorganisms will live on the plant surface, and that will help to prevent the pathogen from taking over there. That's also a way to modify the environment, because the low pH of the EM might make it unsuitable for a pathogen to go there. Another thing to look at is crop rotation.
Stop chewing.
Sometimes,
But I'll fix this.
all right. So crop rotation, if you have a pathogen that gets into your soil or is hanging out in your field, you can plant a different crop in that area the next season, a crop that's not susceptible to that pathogen. And sometimes the pathogens won't live for all that long if they don't have a crop to live off of. And so by rotating out of a susceptible crop for a couple of years, you might be able to bring the crop back that is susceptible, and by that time the pathogen is not there anymore, or at least greatly reduced, so it's going to be less of a problem. Soil treatment, talk about that in a minute. Heat and chemical treatments. So here's a picture of somebody doing weed control. Potato cull piles. Do you know what a cull pile is? That's if you have, when you're harvesting your crops, if there are some of the harvest that's not good enough to sell, those are the culls. So you pile them up and compost them or whatever. But if some of those potatoes, for example, have disease in them, then that cull pile could be a source of disease spreading to your fields. So get rid of those. Crop rotation, burning your infected crop residues. If you have a crop that's has a big disease problem, then it might be worthwhile to burn that crop to get rid of that disease. Otherwise, it's better to compost the crop or turn it into the soil to add organic matter to the soil. But if the disease is a major problem, it might be better to burn the crop. Propane flaming, we talked about using flaming for weed control, and it might also be useful for disease control in some cases. And soil treatment, but this is putting clear plastic on the soil, and the sun will heat up the soil underneath there, and if it's done right, it can heat up the soil enough to kill the pathogen that might be in the soil. As we said before, it also kills all the beneficial organisms in the soil. So this is not something you want to do all the time. It's sort of a last resort. So protection.
Wait a minute. The one before the last one, did it say about it? Or something spread on the floor. Soil treatment. It has plastic there. You didn't mention that.
That is,
Okay, good. It's good. Thank you.
okay. Another type of soil treatment is to put something in the soil that will discourage a pathogen.
All right.
For example, in our greenhouse, we put meat cake in the soil to reduce the nematodes that decrease the nematode problem. So that's another example of a soil treatment. So protection, creating a toxic barrier. I like the, this is not something that we would want to do with regenerative agriculture, is to use something that's terribly toxic on our crop. Something like EM, which sort of creates a biological barrier and modifies the pH to make the surface of the crop. It creates a barrier. So that's a much better way to use than something that's a toxic chemical. Here's some other protection. Bananas are covered with plastic sleeves to protect them. Raised planting beds. By creating raised beds, it improves the drainage, and so the soil in the bed will be drier, and that can help protect the plants from disease, because there are some soil-borne diseases that require a lot of moisture. and resistant varieties, of course. So this is a way to take out the host part of the disease triangle. You create a variety that's not susceptible to the disease. And there are, for many crops, there are varieties available that are resistant to many different diseases. Again, the example in our greenhouses, we grow varieties of tomatoes that are resistant to nematodes. And there's also a fungus disease that we get on the leaves in the greenhouse, and choose varieties that are resistant to that mold. Here's some examples of susceptible and resistant plants. That's sometimes the seeds for varieties that are resistant to disease are a little more expensive than other seeds, but if the disease is going to be a problem, it's really, in the long run, it's going to save you a lot of money. Okay. Therapy. Tree surgery, what makes, this is a funny slide. With tree surgery, there are some diseases that will start out in one part of the tree, and if you catch that early enough, you can prune off that branch and keep it from spreading to the rest of the tree. Like a tree that we often have in this area on our pear trees is fire blight, and if you can catch it soon enough, you can prune off the branch that has the fire blight on it and prevent it from spreading to the rest of the tree. Heat therapy is not something that's easy to accomplish out in the field. All right, I think this is about the end. Yeah. So any more questions?
Yes. What I do see on trees, sometimes that a piece of it's drying out. Let's say one branch, but the other part of the branch is healthy. And so I think that's a type of sickness. I will cut it, that old part before it gets to the, that's something I see here often.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. Because you don't see, it's just you see like a branch is dying.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good thing to do, is remove that branch. And one thing to think about is if there's a virus or a bacteria or fungus in that branch, you want to cut it far enough away from where you see the symptoms, where you see the leaves dried out, so that you know you've got all of the pathogen removed. So you've got your plant, and you know, back to here, you see that the leaves are drying out. Don't cut it right there at the end of where the leaves are drying out, but cut it farther back, because there might be some of the pathogen down in the branch down farther that you don't see. And another thing to do is to clean and sanitize your pruners or your saw before you use it on something else. Soap and water will get off a lot of things. You can clean it with alcohol, and that will kill a lot of the disease organisms, or bleach will kill anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Other question?
Part of the tree that you cut, so do you have to treat it with something of protect them?
Burn it.
No, no, no.
What about it? The cut, the wound. No, that's why he said you have to cut it no further.
Yes, but
You can cover
you can cover
the-
Yeah.
to protect a layer of.
You mean the wound that stay behind, protect it against any for it to go further. I think
Oh.
that's what he asked.
Yeah, because when you cut it, you create an opening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A wound. Yeah.
You could try and disinfect that. Usually what's recommended is not to, people used to paint a wound with some kind of paint to protect it, but now they're not, they're saying that that's not a good idea because that will keep in moisture and create an environment that's more favorable for a disease organism.
Can you use maybe because they use aloe to treat wounds and also to stick plants when you want to, let's say I want to take a branch and I want to make a new plant of it. They do use the aloe for it to grow faster and then.
Yeah, you could do that. Another thing is that if there's a disease in it, the branch that you cut off, you should probably burn that or dispose of it some way where it's not going to infect more of your trees.
Ultimately, these trees have evolved to be able to handle being damaged like this. So the longest term solution is make a very clean cut. Like don't make it ragged or broken. Cut it very cleanly so that it can dry out and harden off itself and make a scab to protect itself. That would be the lowest cost, least effort way to go about making sure that a disease can't get into the cut. Also, when you make the cut, maybe make it in the morning or midday so that it can start drying out before it's moist. Don't cut during a rain or before or just after. You basically want the cut to dry so that a disease, if it were to happen to land on that cut, doesn't have a good environment to spread. Does that cover it, Marco?
I would like to ask, do the diseases have names?
Do they have names? Yes.
Yeah.
Scientists like to name everything. So every disease that we know about has a name.
Oh, yes, because if you would like to look it up, you see, if I want to look it up, so then maybe it would be a good idea to have names of certain diseases that are most common. And the tropical.
Yeah.
So I think the next class we're going to cover more specific diseases. This one, if I'm mistaken, Steve, is just a generalized introduction, right?
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So when I visited last time, a few months ago, I got a few diseases that I was told were primary concerns for the island. So next class, Steve will be addressing some of those and probably a few others that are common in vegetable crops as well.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, there's another set of slides we could look at, more about biological control and cultural control. Would you like to do that? Or you had enough for tonight?
Yes, it's okay. Sure.
Still early.
Really? Okay.
Maybe a break.
Yeah, you want to take another break?
Another break?
Another break, yeah.
How long is this presentation, Steve?
We can make it as long or short as we want.
Sure.
We could probably finish it up in 20 minutes.
You guys want to push through or take a break? What do you want to do?
Just go on. 20 minutes.
Keep going?
Yeah, 20 minutes.
Okay. Somebody time me. Let me know when it's 20 minutes is up.
Yeah, we got you, Steve.
Okay. So this is a lot of writing, but basically there are two kinds of control strategies. Eradicative control measures is designed to eliminate an entire pathogen population. In other words, it wants to kill every single one. This tends to select for resistance in the pathogen. We see this a lot with pesticides. You know, the pesticides try to kill all of the pathogens. For example, we've got late blight on potatoes, and so they develop a fungicide to kill it. But then after repeated use of this, there'll be some of that fungus that develops resistance to that pesticide. So the way this happens is that because there's variation in the population of the fungus, so some of those individuals will have some resistance to the pesticide, and those will be the ones that survive. And so they will multiply, and the ones that are susceptible to the pesticide will die. So then the next generation, more of the fungus will be resistant to the pesticide, and that continues until they're almost all resistant to the pesticide. So another option is, and then, you know, when that happens, you need a new pesticide because the old one doesn't work anymore. And that's called the pesticide treadmill. You know, you have one pesticide and that works for a while, and then it doesn't work anymore. You have to get another pesticide and it works for a while and doesn't work anymore. You got a third pesticide and so on, and you have to keep developing pesticides. Something that is a more long-term strategy is to use management control measures designed to reduce the pathogen population to the point where it's not causing a big problem, but not try to eliminate it entirely. So that's not going to cause the resistance of the pathogen to the control measure. So let's especially look at biological control and cultural control. So let's see. We don't need. Here we go. Antagonists control using microorganisms that inhibit the growth, development, or reproduction of the pathogen. So there are 4 types of antagonists. So these are microorganisms that will inhibit the pathogen. So antibiosis, that's inhibition, inhibition of pathogen through antibiotics produced by the antagonist. So for example, there are some fungi or other organisms that produce antibiotics that will kill bacteria. And so, for example, penicillin is produced by a fungus, and that's used to kill bacterial infections. And so there are, the fungus that produces penicillin is a fungus that occurs naturally in the soil. And so if you have enough of fungi like that, they could prevent, or at least lessen, a disease caused by the bacteria. And there are many examples of that, one organism produces something that inhibits the growth of another organism. Another example is competition, that there can be another organism that competes with the disease-causing organism for food or oxygen or base on the leaf, whatever. So that will reduce the strength of the pathogen because it's not getting enough of the things that it needs. So that can reduce the severity of disease. Amensalism, that one organism makes the environment unsuitable for the pathogen. So this is what the EM does. One of the things that EM does is it modifies the pH, make it less suitable for a disease organism to take over. Parasitism and predation. There are some organisms that directly attack the pathogen. For example, there's fungi that actually trap and digest nematodes in the soil. So that's exciting. There's some fungi that attack other fungi. Trichoderma is one of those that's often used to prevent fungal diseases in the soil, because the trichoderma will actually attack and destroy the disease-causing fungi. And these are some of the things that also happen when you use compost tea and spray that on your plants. There are a wide variety of organisms in the compost tea, and some of those will be antagonistic to the disease-causing organisms. And that's one of the ways that compost tea helps protect your plants. So another form of biological control is to control the insect vectors that spread the disease. One way you can do that is to cover susceptible crops with a fabric row cover, and that keeps the insects out so they can't come in and spread the disease. Cultural control. Okay. Crop rotation, we already talked about that. Selection of planting date or planting location. We already talked about that. Seeding rate and canopy density. This is something that could be important. We had talked about last time about planting plants close together to shade out weeds. But if you have some disease problems, it might be better to plant the plants farther apart so that there's more air circulation, so the plant will dry out faster after a rain. to prevent the development of disease. Does that make sense? You know, if you've got your plants packed close together, then they're going to be, they're going to stay moist longer. And if they're farther apart, the air can blow in between them and dry them out. And a fungus spore or a bacteria, the leaf to be wet in order to grow is going to have a harder time growing if the leaves dry out faster. Irrigation. Again, overhead irrigation can make the leaves wet, and that can favor growth of the fungus. Too much irrigation can lead to wet soils, which can favor the growth of soil-borne pathogens. So using drip irrigation is good because that doesn't wet the leaf, and it puts the water right where the plants need it. Controlling insect vectors. Yeah. Prune disease branches, we just talked about that. Plowing under or burning debris, washing and sterilizing, harvesting and processing equipment. All right. Mulch, the upper left corner, it's mulch. Put mulch down on the soil, and that not only helps to hold the moisture in and adds organic matter to the soil, but it can also prevent soil-borne pathogens from splashing up to the leaves of the plant, causing disease. There are some pathogens that live in the soil. They go from one season to the next in the soil, and the rainwater can cause the soil to splash up onto the leaves and infect the leaves with the pathogens that way. So mulch will prevent that. The bottom right corner is looking at drip irrigation to minimize disease. Quarantines, of course. Chemical control. Okay. Sulfur and copper are two kinds of fungicides that are sometimes used in organic production. You have to be careful in using them not to end up with too much sulfur or copper in your soil, but other than that, they can be effective.
Steve, 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Might be just about done. Okay. Yeah, so here talks about the risks of using chemicals, and we probably don't have to go into that. So to sum up, the control of diseases in crops is largely dominated by the use of fungicides, with the increasing incidence of fungicide resistance plus mounting concern for the environment resulting from excessive agrochemical use. The search for alternative, reliable methods of disease control is gaining momentum. So the purpose is to examine the development and exploitation of the potential for exploitation of a range of non-chemical approaches to disease control, with a focus on the need for a greater understanding of crop ecology as a basis for effective control in the field. I think that says it pretty well. Any questions? I did it in less than 20 minutes. 15 minutes.
13.
13 minutes. Okay. Good.
All right, guys, any other questions for Steve before we finish for the night? Okay, well, then next Monday is going to be talking about more specific diseases and addressing some things that you guys are likely seeing or have seen on the island itself.
Yeah.
I won't be present next meeting, so it'll be Steve and Snellio and Roland running the show. So be on your best behavior. You guys.
Oh, with Chris not watching, we can have lots of fun.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Right.
Bye.
I should